I think that Colorado Christian University is distinguished amongst every college and university, large and small, private, independent, or religious, in the United States. Colorado Christian University would stand foremost that between 2009, when we started Centennial Institute here, the late Bill Armstrong, Colorado Christian University's president, asked me to start a policy think tank here, a public speakers program. Between 2009 and 2015, I'm sure we had, in quantity, more speakers who sounded the warning about jihad and Sharia and the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood and the global Islamic movement for an Islamic world than any other college or university, bar none, and not only in quantity, but in the absolute unrestrained candor of the message that they brought. So even though this is not an official CCU event this evening, it's certainly in keeping with the continuity of something that's been going on this campus and almost uniquely across the country on this campus for almost a decade now. My friend and colleague and comrade in many a battle for God and country, my gentleman on my right, retired airline pilot, retired former Marine, Vietnam combat pilot David Petties, had been telling me about the OSCE conference and the mighty impact of a small, fearless delegation led by Elisabeth Wolff, and I wanted to be part of it this fall for the first time. It's organized so that one signs up first thing in the morning to be sure to have a 2-minute speaking slot as one after another the non-governmental organizations are yielded the microphone and given our opportunity to comment on the topic of the day. I had the advantage of being the wide-eyed newcomer, and when it came my turn, I said something to the effect of how dispiriting and troubling it was for me to have come to a conference that I understood to be about free speech and human rights, and to be slapped with the realization that the historic openness of thought in Europe since the Reformation and the Enlightenment 300, 400, or 500 years ago had yielded to this darkness, this repression, this thought control. And the way I put it was the great Voltaire, the French philosopher, who famously said, "I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Voltaire, I said to this conference, seems to have been inverted. And to this American newcomer, how troubling it is to learn of evidence, and I did not cite by name my friend Elisabeth, but I was thinking of her and many others. I said to the conference, how disturbing to learn of evidence that now Voltaire's maxim is stood on its head, and governments say to their citizens, "We disagree with what you say and we will jail you or fine you for daring to say it." And a little ripple went through the room because I was treading on toes. And I was doing so because I had been coached to do so.
By me.
We did not formally set out to have a competition to make sure that each of us would be rebuked by the moderator at the end of our 2 minutes, but it got to be a badge of honor. I then went on and said, that's not all, Madam Moderator, because it's worse. I had been coached to speak euphemistically about Islam, and so I think I said, it's to the point where one of the great world religions, I didn't name Islam, one of the great world religions is now saying to all of us, we disagree with what you say and we will kill you for daring to say it. And I went on and said, don't take my word for it. This is not an exaggeration, this is not fantasy. You can ask the Danish cartoonists who caricatured Muhammad. You can ask the dead at Charlie Hebdo magazine in Paris, slaughtered for daring to express themselves freely. You can ask the American Pamela Geller, who narrowly escaped with her life in Dallas for offending Muslim sensibilities. So, at the end of my remarks, I said, this feels more like George Orwell than Voltaire. And with an Orwellian fitness, at the end of my remarks, the moderator, not realizing the absurdity of what she's saying, she said, "Thank you, and we remind you of the commitment to tolerance and non-discrimination." As if tolerance and non-discrimination should have gagged me. It was her wish that I would have been gagged. I want to yield now to David Petty's, because Dave, you've been to several of these, and you have really been more energetic in getting the message out across Colorado since the two of us arrived back here 2 months ago. Talk about your impressions of the Warsaw Conference.
Yeah, I've been going to these conferences about 5 years, well, for the last 5 years. And Elisabeth alluded to the fact that Europe's ahead of America in its Islamization. So, always, in the Marine Corps, it's Semper Fidelis. That means always faithful and always the fighter. So I thought, well, let's go to the front line and fight there. We'll fight them as far away as possible. So one of the things, when we went up to talk to the moderator afterwards, there was a large black man, Muslim. He was from Nigeria. And he looked at us and he said, "We know who you are, we know what you believe, but we let you come anyway." Then he said, "We have a different truth. We have a different truth. You have your opinions and truth, we have our opinions and truth." And so it's strictly moral relativism. And so anyway, what I've got in this bag I wanted to share, I've got all the documents for Islamic doctrine. I've got this Quran, the Hadith, and a little packet, and the Sirah. And it's interesting to me how strong opinions people have. You say to them, they'll say, "Well, I think we should do this and that about Islam." And I say, "Have you read the documents? Do you know what's in the Quran? Do you know what's in the Sirah? Do you know what's in the Hadith?" And he's, "Well, I don't need to know that because I've got a good friend, Ahmed, and he tells me what I need to know." And I can only point out that the Muslim Brotherhood owns all the mosques, all the imams, all the community centers. They're all on the same page, and they will mischaracterize the truth of Islamic doctrine. And it sounds so good and so peaceful because they do the earlier surahs.
So, explain about the earlier surahs.
Well, I'll show you. I have here a Quran, Abdullah Yusuf Ali Quran. The reason you want to get one produced by the Muslims themselves, they have tons of footnotes. And these are kind of like ponies. They have the Arabic and they have the English. And in the front I have here it's a breakdown of the surahs by chronological order. And we've alluded to the fact that the earlier ones are the peaceful ones because Muhammad was earlier in time because Muhammad was in Mecca and weak. The later ones was when he went to Medina, took it over, and was very strong. So then he got a little more belligerent. But when you go to universities today, they only teach the early ones. And it sounds so good. And it's so compatible with Christianity.
And David, am I correct that theologically Muslims believe that the later written Holy Scripture, if it conflicts with the earlier version, the later written version is governing? And so if peaceful coexistence, like that ridiculous bumper sticker, seems to be counseled in an early passages of the Quran, and violent jihad and mayhem and bloodshed and dominance are counseled later on, the later in time passage prevailed, right?
That's the concept of abrogation. The earlier surahs are abrogated by the later ones, but they are both true. And this is where the Western mind can't get around it. Early, they said it was black. Later, they said it was white. And so we say, wait a minute, which one is it? And the Muslims can choose either one that they want. They roll it out, roll out the one which suits their purpose at the time. Because even though they are diametrically opposed, since they are revealed by Allah, they are both true.
That's why the liberals understand it, right?
Yes.
We'll open it for questions in a minute.
Can I add something about?
Please do.
Because I also wanted to tell one of the stories from the OSCE. I wanted to talk about, and I know that Bill doesn't like me to talk about it, but the feeling of what it was like in the plenary, because I think in this case it is important. You know, in these plenaries where we all sit together, the freedom lovers and the freedom haters, I always felt like I was in the middle of a war. And if our enemies could have, they would have wanted to shoot us. Right there on the spot. There was so much hatred for what we had to say. I mean, I could really feel that hatred. I mean, they looked at me and looked at us.
Daggers.
Dagger, yeah, exactly. It was daggers. And that showed me that we were onto something once again. With the experience of so many years, you know, since 2009 at the OSCE, I can tell you that the situation for us has deteriorated in the sense that the stronger we have become, the more pushback, of course, there has been from our opponents. But also that there are quite a few who come up to us after our little so-called interventions of 2 minutes to pat our back, to exchange business cards. Sometimes even diplomats come up to us and they pat us on the back because they're not allowed to do that officially. So there are a lot of people out there who silently agree with us. But you all know what the problem is. You know, if you're silent, silence means consent. And it has always been my dream, ever since I started traveling to the United States on a regular basis, at least twice a year, to explain to the Americans how important the playing field of the OSCE really is. It's not just about the 2 minutes that we get. As some people say, well, it's not worth traveling all the way from the US or Canada to Warsaw just to be given the opportunity to speak for 2 minutes. Yes, it is, because you can actually say everything you want to say in 2 minutes. You don't need half an hour. You don't need 45 minutes. And you also have the opportunity, which is actually a very important opportunity, to submit your not only 2 minutes that you spoke, but also an elaboration of those 2 minutes to the official OSCE record. And that's another reason why I think it's important that we attend these meetings, because it's historical and public record. I never want my daughter to later on ask me, when all is over and done and we've been hopefully victorious, or not, what happens if we weren't victorious? Is she gonna come up to me and ask me, well, Mom, you saw what was happening, why didn't you do anything about it? I mean, she's not gonna say that because she knows what I'm doing, but I could point her to, go to the OSCE, go to the public record. Do you know how many speeches I've given? Do you know how many times I've spoken up? Do you know how many times I've been rebuked? It's all there on the record. There are a bunch of people who speak out, who speak up and speak out and defend our principles. And we will continue to do that. And I think John is starting to have a lot of fun there, so I guess